So none of that had anything to do with Python. And we can do this without it, right? Like we can just, if we wanted some information, but if we just wanted like one piece of information, it would be much easier to just use the Weibo site. We don't need to go through all this data, right? The reason we do this is because we can use Python to actually not only automatically turn this huge amount of data into just the data we want, so we can pick and choose different parts of it. We can also automate it and go through all the pages, many users, many locations, whatever, to get these very large data sets. Okay, so I am gonna get into writing the actual code. I'll try to make this a little bit bigger. Let's start building this code. The first thing we can do in Python is think about how to make this URL more dynamic so we can actually input the information instead of having to retype it every time into variables that then we can change and rebuild these URLs dynamically. Okay, so what I'm going to do is create some variables. So I have my base URL. You guys remember variables, right? They can be any name as long as there's no spaces. So my first variable will be the base URL, and that's going to be this URL I got from here. So I'm just going to make that as a string variable. Okay. And now, just like last week, we can start combining different variables to build this string in Python. The next variable I'm going to have is my access token. This is the same exact thing I did in this Word file, but now we can just use Python to kind of make it more efficient. So that's my token. And then, yeah, just go through this same thing. I'm going to have my point of interest. And all I'm doing right now is breaking up this information so that we can always replace it later, right? So this is here. If I have a new point of interest or a new access token, I can just put that information as that variable. And then I'll just make two variables for my count. And see, even if it's a number, I'm using quotes because I want this all to be a string so I can smush it all together. I don't want to deal with, I don't want Python to think I'm doing some number calculations or anything like that. And then page, I'm going to do 1. This is the same exact information we entered before, but now I'm going to create this string just by adding together a bunch of these parameters. So my URL, this will be my final URL. It's going to be a combination of all these parameters. First, my base URL, right? To that, I'm going to add a question mark. So when I start adding strings, it's called concatenation. I'm just smushing them together. I'm taking one and putting the other one right next to it. So when I do something like this, here we can just print this just to see how it's going. It'll just literally take that URL string and just add a question mark to it. You know, and then spaces also count as characters, so you know, if you want to start typing out some commands, you can put it in space like that. Okay, just keep that there. So we have to add a bunch of other stuff to this. After the question mark, we have this entire structure, right? So we need some amount of just text, and then we put in our variables. So the next piece of text is access token. This is just redoing exactly what I did, but now it's going to be in Python. So access token equals. To that, we're going to actually add our access token. And then go through the other ones. We're going to do this ampersand, POIID, equals. Add to that our, and then the same thing for count. Add our count, and then the same thing for page, and add our page. Okay, so this shouldn't be confusing. We're just taking these and putting all these strings together just like we did manually, but now when we print our URL, we can literally take this and paste it, and just to verify that it's still working, that we're still getting this data. Okay, and the reason we did this is by breaking it up, now we can easily put in other numbers. So maybe we want the second page. Okay, we can get that data. And what Python's going to allow us to do is by using those loops and conditionals that we went over last week, we can actually structure this to automatically loop through a series of things. Instead of us each time running it, pasting it, into the browser, where we can do something like loop over all the pages that there are and give me the data for each page, right? Okay, so that's awesome. We're generating URLs, but we still have to manually paste them into the browser. And what are we going to do then? Like copy and paste them? I don't know. It doesn't make sense. Sounds super tedious. So the next thing we're going to do is actually use Python to download that data automatically from the internet without going to Chrome. Okay, and for that there are a number of libraries that basically do the same thing. The one we're going to use now is called urllib2. So I don't think we went over libraries last week, but I think I mentioned that libraries are a way that people have expanded the capabilities of Python by adding in other functions. So for instance, basic Python is built to handle variables and do basic calculations, but to do something specific like go online and get a piece of data, there's another library for it, and we can use everything in that library. We just need to first import it into our code. It gives the code a link back to that library. Okay, and to import libraries, it's pretty simple. You just say import, and in this case, we're going to use this library, urllib2. Cool. And with importing, there's some rules of thumb or some like kind of accepted ways to do this. Typically, you'll find all the imports for a script at the top of the script, and this is the way you'll see it in the finished scripts. That's just to make it very clear at the beginning what pieces of outside code that script is using, and that's just kind of an adopted style. Really, all you have to do is make sure that that import is occurring somewhere in the script before you're referencing it. If you try to reference urllib2 before it's imported, it'll give you an error. Okay, but typically the easiest way to keep track of it is just by doing them all in the beginning of the script. I'll just keep it here for now so we can kind of have this flow of ideas. Okay, so we have this library. It comes with a bunch of different functions that we can use to use this library. The function we're going to do is called urlopen. So the way that libraries are accessed is you type their name. So here, urllib2, and then dot. And the dot syntax allows you access into all the functions of the library. So you can think of a library as like a toolbox, right? And in that toolbox is a bunch of tools you can use called functions, and each function does a particular thing. And to gain access into those functions, you have to specify the name of the library, and then the dot, and then the name of the function. Okay, and this is really ubiquitous in Python. Everything is always, to get into a piece of data, you use the square brackets. To get into a library or function, you use the dot. Okay, so we say urllib2 dot urlopen, and that's a function like we talked about last week. So functions do something and give you something back based on some inputs, right? So you take some data, you input into the function, you run that function, the function gives you some information back. And the inputs you pass through parentheses. So right after the function name, you put a pair of parentheses. In here, you put all the inputs into that function. And whatever it gives you back, it will give you out of this function. So we have to set it equal to some variable, and that variable will be assigned to the output. So what urlopen will do is it will take a URL as an input, and it'll give you back whatever data comes back as an output. So what we want to do here is, as an input, we'll put in our URL. So we have this already generated, right? So we're going to give this URL to urlopen, and the result we're going to store in a variable called response. Okay? So now if we run this, it might take a little while now, because what it's actually doing is it's sending that information to the server and getting stuff back. It's doing the exact same thing you would do if you type that into the address bar. It takes a little while to load up, right? So these codes will start running a bit slower because it's actually kind of browsing the internet, you might say. Okay, so nothing really happened. We have this response stored here. I think it's still stored. Yep. So if we type it in, it's not really usable in this form. It just has a link to that object. So it's some kind of web object that's stored in our code now. To gain access to the actual text of that data, we need a second function. called read. And read is a really flexible function. You can use it to read text files that you reference from your computer system or online files or anything like that. And it will just basically convert that link to that object into a piece of text or whatever that data is. Okay? So here we'll do the data. This will actually be our final data set. We're going to put in the response. So this is our link to that object from the internet. And we're going to apply a function to it. So just like we use the dot syntax to find a function in a library, we use the dot syntax to apply functions to objects. Okay? So what we can do is have the response dot read and parentheses. So the parentheses you're always going to have with functions, but sometimes functions require inputs and sometimes they're optional. So read has some inputs, but they're all optional, and we just want to use the default options. So we can just leave the parentheses blank. But you have to have the parentheses just because it's a part of the structure of the code. Okay, so what they'll do is they'll take the response and they'll apply this read function. So you'll see this, there's two ways that basically functions work in Python. Sometimes you pass things into a function like this, or sometimes you apply the function directly onto it. This won't work, this will, and it depends on which function you're using, which syntax you use. Okay, it's a little bit confusing, it seems arbitrary. You just have to know which one is what, but those are the only two ways that it's done. Okay, so in this case we're passing things into it, in this case we're applying the function to it. So once we do that, let's just print this data and run it again. So every time I'm running this, it's accessing that API. So it's counting against my 150 limits. Just be aware of that as you're troubleshooting code. It's fine to do this because you're not going to hit 150 times just by running it once in a while. But if you're doing a lot of runs back to back, you might get to that limit. Okay. All right. So I accessed that response. I converted it into a piece of data, text, and I printed it. Here's all that data. Okay. It's just come in. I just printed it to my console here. It's the same stuff we saw in Chrome, okay? So that's the basic download of the data. All you need is these two functions, basically, to do that.